Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of the 4SkidsTV YouTube hacking series. I know it's been quite some time since my last video in this series, but I'm back, and this video we're going to be talking about dumping passwords in memory on Windows systems. So I know a lot of you may already be familiar with everything that's discussed in this video, so I've added chapters to help people jump around to the portions of the video that cover things they may be unfamiliar with. And as I said in the beginning of this video series, this series is mostly geared toward beginner and intermediate penetration testers who are looking to obtain the skills in order to conduct thorough penetration tests on Windows networks with antivirus software enabled. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So to start the video off, I'm going to do what I do in most of my videos, which is go over to a Windows 10 virtual machine and check for updates to ensure that it's fully up to date. So we click the check for updates button, and after a few seconds of waiting, we should see that we are fully up to date. And under the protection updates in the Windows Security Intelligence section, we can check for updates here to make sure that our antivirus database is also up to date, which it is. And then we can go to the virus and threat protection settings and click manage settings and see that real-time protection is turned on, cloud delivered protection is turned on. The only thing that's turned off is automatic sample submission so that our files aren't automatically submitted to Microsoft. And there are no exclusions listed. So now that that's done, we can get into the first thing that we'll be demoing, which is how to dump passwords in memory using the Task Manager. So dumping passwords using Task Manager is probably the easiest way to dump passwords in memory without needing any third-party tools or software that could potentially get flagged by the antivirus. You will need an interactive session on whatever host you're doing this on, as Task Manager, of course, needs an interface in order to be used. So right here you can see we do have that, and the same would be for any situation where you're RDPing into a host, you're logging in using Citrix, or something like VMware Horizon Client. So since we have our interactive session, we can go to the taskbar at the bottom of the page and open Task Manager, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with doing. And once we have it open, we're going to go to the Details tab, and then we're going to look for a process called LSASS.exe. Now, pretty much every single tool that we use today will involve dumping the data from this process, LSASS.exe, as this is the process that contains the login credentials of every user logged into the machine. So now that we've found the process, we can right-click it and find the button that says Create Dump File and click it. And it's as easy as that. We've dumped the process data for LSASS.exe, and the pop-up shows us where we can find it, right? So we're going to select that location, we're going to copy it, and then we're going to open a PowerShell window. And in order to read the data that's been dumped by Task Manager, we're going to need to exfiltrate this file off of the system onto a system running Linux. So we can do that with PowerShell using the scp command, which is, secure copy using SSH. And then we're going to give it the file that we just got in that pop-up. And then we're going to point it toward our Kali Linux virtual machine and store it in the temp directory. And you can see I'm using the root user to log in. Never do this. I'm just doing this for this demo. Always create, a lesser privileged user that can do this. But data exfiltration is another topic that we'll cover another time as well. This is just for easy demonstration purposes. So once we have that, we can hit enter. It'll ask us for our password, which we can type in. And you can see that it was transferred successfully. So now if we head back to our Kali Linux virtual machine, I have to log in again. And now that we're logged in, we should be able to find that file in our temp folder. There it is right there. And now we need a tool that can read this file in order to show us the credentials that we dumped. So luckily for us, there's a tool called Mimikatz, which can be used like so. Sorry, that's the wrong thing. So here you can see we have the Mimikatz command, and we're giving it the LSA argument and the mini-dump argument. And then from there, we just simply have to point it to our LSASS dump that we obtained earlier, and then hit the enter command. And you will see a bunch of output that you can then scroll through in order to find possible user credentials that were dumped using Task Manager. So right here you can see we got a username Randy and we have his NT hash, right? So that shows how you can use the Task Manager in order to dump lsass.exe, then transfer the dump file over to a Linux virtual machine or Linux server if you're doing this remotely, and then parse using Mimikatz. So now that we've covered dumping LSASS using Task Manager, which is one of the most simple ways to do it, we're going to focus on a few more methods that are a little bit more versatile and that can be used in situations where you don't have an interactive logon session on whatever host you're trying to do it on. And we're first going to start with PowerShell and a script called outminidump.ps1. So right now you can see I'm on GitHub looking at PowerShell Mafia's Powersploit archive, and the outminidump.ps1 script is a script that can essentially do what we just did using the Task Manager, except through PowerShell, and obviously, as I said, does not require a interactive session. So we're first going to select the raw data so that we can then copy it, and then open a text editor and paste it in. And then we're going to save this script under the 4SkidsTV folder as outminidump.ps1, and then hit save. And now under our folder, we should see it right here, ready to use. So we can set up a simple Python HTTP server on port 80, and then head back over to our Windows 10 virtual machine, open a PowerShell prompt as administrator, and then try to use the script that we just downloaded. So we can do that using IEX, and then invoke web request using the use basic parsing flag, and then pointing it toward our web server that we just stood up on our Kali Linux virtual machine, and giving it the file outminidump.ps1, and then we can hit enter to see if we can load it in memory. And you'll notice that we get an error stating that this script contains malicious content and has been blocked by your antivirus software. So are we stuck? What should we do? If some of you are familiar with some of my other videos, you'll know that this can be bypassed with something called an AMSI bypass, but we don't even really need to do that for this because there's a simple way that we can modify this in order to get this detection not come up anymore. So we're going to go back to our Kali Linux virtual machine, and we're going to look at our file. And the first thing I tried, which is the simplest thing to do, is simply removing the stuff you don't need, which, first of all, is the usage. So we can just take the comment, which explains all the usage for this file, and delete it. Then we can resave the file, go back to our Python listener, start it up again, and then go to the Windows 10 virtual machine and rerun the command we just ran. And you can see that we were able to download it, import it in memory, and it did not get detected this time. So now that we've imported it in memory, we're going to run the following command in order to actually use it and dump the LSASS process once more in order to get the passwords from it. So that can be done like so. I actually don't need to download and import it again because I just imported it. So we're going to use the get process and command and give it the LSASS argument in order to get the LSASS process, and then we're going to pipe that into the outminidump function that is in our script that we just imported. So if we hit enter, you can see we've created the LSASS _664.dump file, which we can then transfer over like we did before using SCP. Pointing to our Kali Linux virtual machine and storing it in the temp directory. So if we hit enter and then enter in our password, you can see that we transferred it with no issue. And then if we head back over to our Linux virtual machine and run the Mimikatz command that we ran earlier, pointing it to the file that we just transferred, you can see that we get the same output, and we can also find the credentials of the users that were logged in on the system. So right here, you can see we got Randy again, and we can see his NT hash. So this is demonstrating how you can use PowerShell in order to dump LSASS.exe, and then again transfer the file off the system and parse it using Mimikatz. So by no means is PowerShell the only way to dump LSASS, as I just demonstrated. There's a bunch of different tools written in a bunch of different languages that are capable of doing the exact same thing. For the sake of the length of this video, I'm only going to be demonstrating one more tool, and that's a tool that was written in C# by a person called Slydog. And right now you can see I'm looking at his GitHub repository, C# out minidump, and as he says, it's a C# implementation of the out minidump.ps1 script that we just demonstrated. So in order to use this, we can go to the source file for it. We can then again select the raw data and then copy it as we did with the other script. Go into a text editor, open a new file, and then paste it in. And then we can save this file as minidump.cs. So if we try to compile this just how it is right now, we can go to our terminal, clear it, and then list the contents of the directory. We have our minidump file right here. If we run mcs minidump, you'll see that we get an error stating that the program minidump.exe does not contain a static main method suitable for an entry point. So in order to get this to work, we just have to make a couple simple modifications to the file that we just got from the GitHub repository. So as it was saying, the main method is no good for this. So we can change that main method to say dump instead of main. And then we can create a new main method. So we can do public static void main. We won't give it any arguments because we don't need to. And then we can call the dump method like so, giving it null as the first parameter, which is the path that the file will save the dump to. And if it's null, it'll just use the current directory as stated in the comment. So we'll give it null. And then for the process, we're obviously going to be using LSASS, as that's the process that contains the passwords that we want to read. So once that's done, we can save this and then go back to our terminal and run the command to compile it one more time. As you can see, this time we only got one warning, but that's okay, it should still work. Now we'll host a Python simple HTTP server as we did in the last section. And now we're ready to go back to our Windows 10 PC. We have to re-log in as Kevin. And then once we're logged in, we can go and open a PowerShell terminal as administrator. And we're going to cd into our current user's home directory. And then we can download the file that we just created using invoke web request. Remember to use basic parsing. File is called minidump.exe. Give it the out file flag and save it as minidump.exe. And now we'll hit enter to download it. As you can see, it's saved to the disk with no problem. And now if we execute it, we can see that it created a dump file, LSASS_664.dmp, and we can then use that with Mimikatz in order to read the credentials that were dumped. Now, there may be a lot of situations where transferring the dump file that we just created out of the network onto a Linux machine in order to parse the results is rather difficult or time-consuming. So luckily for us, there's a new project that was recently created by a person called Cube0. And if we go back to our Kali Linux virtual machine and go to the GitHub page for it, you can see it right here. It's also called minidump, and it's essentially just a C# tool that will parse the dump file that we just created directly on the disk so that we don't need to transfer it onto a Linux machine. So to demonstrate that real quick, we can go to a terminal and stop our listener, or rather our web server, and then we can transfer the LSASS parser into our current directory, list the directory, and we can see that it's right there, ready to be used. Set up our server again, and then go back to our Windows 10 virtual machine, and then we can download it with the following command. As you can see, we're just calling out to our Linux virtual machine to download it and save it to the disk. And now that we have it on the disk, we can run it like so, and then give it the file that we just dumped. And you can see that the LSASS parser was able to parse the file that we dumped in the previous step and show us the credentials of the users logged into the system. So this is just a much easier way to obtain the parsed data from the dump files that you create without needing to transfer the file outside of the system. So you can see that Cube0's LSASS parser makes things a lot easier when dealing with these dump files on the system. I've actually gone a step further and combined Slydog's out minidump tool with Cube0's LSASS parser in order to make a single file that can be used to automatically dump LSASS and then parse the results directly on the system. So we can look at that by going back to our Kali Linux virtual machine and going to my GitHub repository, dump and parse. And this is a solution that you can build using Visual Studio or another program. And as I say in the description for it, like I said before, it's a combination of Slydog's tool and Cube0's tool so that you can dump LSASS automatically and parse the data directly on the disk. So to demonstrate that real quick, we can go back to our test directory, clear it so that we have a nice clear terminal, and then copy the dump and parse tool from the previous directory into the current one, list the current directory, and we can see it's there, and then run our Python HTTP server. Now we can go back to our Windows 10 PC and go back to our terminal. And now we can download the dump and parse tool like so. Make sure that it's saved successfully, which it did. And then we can just run it like so. And you'll see that it automatically dumped LSASS for us without needing any arguments, saved it to the disk, and then parsed the results. The last tool that we'll be covering in this video is one that I'm sure most of you are already familiar with, called Mimikatz. Now, if we just use the normal version of Mimikatz, we'll definitely get detected by whatever AV is running on the system that we're trying to use it on. So instead, I'm going to demonstrate a few different Mimikatz variations, all using PowerShell, that will allow us to dump the passwords in memory without being detected by the AV. So to start off, we're going to go back to our Kali Linux virtual machine and take a look at Nishang's invoke_mimikatz.ps1 script created by Samratashak. Now, this is essentially just Mimikatz in PowerShell, which will allow us to download and execute Mimikatz in memory after running an AMSI bypass, allowing us to run Mimikatz without it getting detected by the antivirus. So to demonstrate that, we can go back to our Windows 10 virtual machine and clear the console, and then start to run the necessary commands. So the first command that we're going to run is going to download an AMSI bypass and execute it in memory using IEX. And you can see that that worked and returned a true. The next command that we're going to run is going to download the invoke mimikatz.ps1 script that we just showed, and then import it into memory using IEX. And now that we have the script in memory, we can execute it using the invoke Mimikatz command, and then hit enter. And after a few seconds, we should see the output of Mimikatz and see that it was able to successfully run without being detected by the antivirus and show us the hashes of the users currently logged into the system. So this version of Mimikatz should be sufficient in almost any situation where you need to dump the passwords on a system, but I will be demonstrating a couple more variants still, just in case this version ever stops working, or you just want to be aware of the other options that are available. So the next version of Mimikatz that we're going to be testing is called SharpKatz. And SharpKatz is a C# version of Mimikatz, but we will be using the PowerShell version of it. As I said earlier, all of these Mimikatz variants are easier to use in PowerShell, as they can be used directly after running an AMSI bypass, allowing them to run without being detected. So you can see we're looking at Secure This Shit's PowerSharp Pack public GitHub repository. And if we search for SharpKatz, you can see it's right here, invoke SharpKatz.ps1, and now we can demonstrate it on our Windows 10 PC. So we're going to close out of our old PowerShell terminal and open a new one as administrator. And we're going to run a few commands that will allow us to execute the SharpKatz PowerShell script. The first command we're going to run, as we did before, will download and execute an AMSI bypass in memory using IEX. The next command will download the invoke SharpKatz.ps1 file from Secure This Shit's PowerSharp Pack GitHub repository and load it into memory using IEX. And then we can simply run the invoke SharpKatz command to execute SharpKatz. And after waiting a few seconds, you can see that we also got a working output from SharpKatz containing the credentials of the users logged into the system. So the last version of Mimikatz that we're going to be demonstrating in this video is called BetterSafetyKatz. And BetterSafetyKatz is a C# tool that will automatically download the latest version of Mimikatz and execute it in memory, allowing us to have an interactive Mimikatz prompt in which we can run any command we want. And in this demo, we'll just be running the command that will allow us to dump the passwords. So to demonstrate that, we're first going to go back to our Linux virtual machine. And again, we're looking at Secure This Shit's PowerSharp Pack public GitHub repository. And we can see here the invoke BetterSafetyKatz.ps1 script. And again, we're using PowerShell because it's much easier to just load and execute in memory after running a PowerShell AMSI bypass in order to get around the antivirus detecting it. So to demonstrate that, we're going to go back to our Windows 10 PC. We're going to close our old PowerShell terminal and open a new one as administrator. And then we're going to begin running the necessary commands in order to use BetterSafetyKatz. So as we did with all the other Mimikatz versions, we're first going to download and execute an AMSI bypass using IEX. That returned a true. And then we're going to download the BetterSafetyKatz.ps1 script from Secure This Shit's PowerSharp Pack GitHub repository and then load it into memory using IEX. And finally, we're going to run the invoke BetterSafetyKatz command in order to execute the file. As you can see, it's contacting the GitHub repo to download the latest version of Mimikatz, and eventually it will give us a prompt. And here you can see we get the prompt. Defender hasn't been alerted at all. And we can now type in the command to dump the passwords, which is secure LSA : logon passwords. And you can see that that executed with no problem, showing us the passwords of the users logged into the system without being flagged by the antivirus. And with that, we have concluded the second part of the 4SkidsTV YouTube hacking series. I hope you all enjoyed and possibly learned something. That'd be great. I will be making a part 3, which will be data exfiltration, as I discussed earlier. Hopefully in the next month or two, depending on if I feel lazy or not. But I really appreciate all the support that this channel's been getting. And yeah, stay tuned for some more content. Thank you guys so much.